John, talk to me about the legal issues an entrepreneur needs to consider.
Okay, well, one of the first issues they need to consider is whether or not to incorporate a company or to trade as a sole trader. If people are thinking about setting up a company, one of the things they need to think about is who will be the directors, who will be the shareholders. One of the advantages of having a company is that you get limited liability. Other issues you need to think about when setting up a company would be the taxation, how that would work, and whether you're working in an industry which would allow you to set up a company, because certain industries you need to set up as a sole trader or a partnership. So that's the first key question: is do you set up a sole trader or a company or perhaps a partnership? If you are setting up as a sole trader or a partnership, you'd need to consider registering a business name, and you can get further information on setting up companies and business names on the Company Registration Office website, which is www.cro.ie. The second issue you need to think about is how you're going to finance the company or finance your operations. Typically, if you're getting money from Enterprise Ireland or from venture capitalists, they'll want to invest through a company rather than through a partnership. So that's the most common vehicle we'd see. The other issue you need to think about is your intellectual property. So depending on what industry you're involved in, you may want to register a trademark, you may have a patent which may need to be registered, and if you are producing copyright material or software, you should include a copyright notice on it. In addition, if you are entering into contracts with consultants who are producing intellectual property for you, whether it's logos or designs or brands or trademarks or reports, you should ensure that you either have a license to use that content or branding, or you take ownership of it, and that should take place as part of a written contract. Again, it'd be an important thing for when you are paying consultants or third parties to create intellectual property for you, that you have a written contract that gives you the right to use or the ownership in that intellectual property.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Another issue which people need to consider is a shareholders agreement. And again, this can be an area where there can be differences of opinion between shareholders. But typically, a good shareholders agreement will deal with issues such as what percentage each individual or what number of shares each individual will hold in the company, how you deal with future transfers of shares, what happens on the death of a shareholder, who will be on the board of directors, how the company will be financed, can the company borrow money, how will meetings of the board of directors be dealt with. All those type of issues are typically dealt with in a shareholders agreement. And when you have multiple shareholders, it is advisable to have a shareholders agreement. Many of these issues can also be dealt with in the Articles of Association, but the more typical route would be for a shareholders agreement to deal with lots of these points. You'd also need to deal with issues such as future financing, future issue of shares, how can current existing investors, can they participate in future rounds, and also what class of shares you might have. Typically ordinary shares are the most common class of shares, but if you're receiving financing from Enterprise Ireland or from a venture capitalist, they'll typically some form of preference shares. Yep. So again, that's the next document for people to consider. The other category of document to consider is where you have employees on board. You need to have an employment contract and you need to have employment policies in place. And again, that's the whole separate work stream, but it's something which you need to think about, as employees would be entitled to written terms of their contract. Other points which I think people need to consider would be your standard contracts for doing business. So it'd be advisable in whatever industry you're involved in to have your standard terms of business. And that would include if you're selling goods or services. You'd also need to consider if you're in the technology space or if you're involved in disclosing confidential information to have an appropriate non-disclosure agreement in place. So in terms of a checklist for standard documents, your standard terms of business you should perhaps have a non-disclosure agreement. You should have your employment contracts for employees. If you have a company with multiple shareholders, then you should consider having a shareholders agreement. If you're involved in commissioning intellectual property, it should be done so in writing. And if you are letting people use your intellectual property, whether it's software or copyright material, then you should have a written license to deal with that, rather than just handing over the software and letting people use it. These things should all be dealt with by formal licenses. If you are taking in finance, again, you may have a separate documentation dealing with that. For example, if you're taking in money from venture capitalist or from Enterprise Ireland, there'll be some form of subscription agreement. So there are some of the categories of documentation that you may end up having as part of starting up a business.